is 1 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time, and hello and welcome to the Alpha Anywhere Demo and Q&A webcast. My name is Dave McCormick, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Dan McCormick, our lead solutions engineer. Dan McCormick, no relation to me. We get that question a lot of the time. We have excellent last names that we like to think. Today, Dan will be covering the client-side data cache. And this is sort of a part 2 of what he started yesterday. After that, he'll be ready to take your questions. So go ahead and type your questions in now into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. So let's get started. Hello, Dion. Are you there?
Yes, sir. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this week. Missed y'all in my previous week, but you know, what I'm very excited about is we're going to continue talking about disconnected data today. And that's a key topic for most people that I engage with and talk with. Really exciting to see what people are doing with the technology, and we want to keep pushing that forward. Also, we have some really good questions that came in. We're going to try and get to all those, but in the meantime, help us out by going into the questions area of your GoToWebinar control panel. Put your questions in there. Dave will be monitoring that closely and lining them up for presentation and discussion during our session here today. And speaking of questions, every question you ever have about Alpha is going to be delivered at Alpha DevCon 2016. We're only a couple weeks away. And in fact, just kind of an announcement, we won't be having a weekly Q&A webinar next week or the week after, because the week after is DevCon and we got to kind of do our homework to make sure everything's ready for that next week. So we'll be returning back here in about 3 weeks or so. But in the meantime, there's still a few slots available, very few. We filled up a lot in the last week. It's amazing. Everybody's just kind of ready to go. And so we have our pre-training day. That's the day before DevCon. DevCon is September 21st to the 23rd, and on the 20th we'll be doing our pre-training day. It's going to be an awesome event. You'll walk away ready to rock and roll with all the latest mobile optimized forms capability and a lot of sessions. We've actually been tuning up a lot of sessions, and if you have a particular need requirement in regards to Alpha, the experts are going to be available and be there, and there'll be lots of opportunities for you to sit down and talk to the people and kind of get your questions answered, and also make connections with other individuals who can help you as you continue on your developer's journey. So as Dave mentioned, I'm going to be continuing my discussion regarding disconnected data and diving in particular to something called client-side data cache. So first, what I'm going to do is go ahead and do a quick refresh. So when you are building disconnected systems, one of the most critical aspects is the ability to manage offline data. To be able to bring it down from a server, manage it locally, utilize it locally, and then obviously synchronize it back up to the server. And there's a couple of different methods, or a few different methods. First and foremost is our list control. That's the heavyweight member of this, which will handle all of the synchronization of data from a back-end system to a front-end system, a mobile disconnected application, maintain the offline state of that information, allow you to edit it, insert data, and then connect back into it. So that it has the most horsepower of any of the tools. But Alpha has continued to enhance the capabilities of our development environment to provide you even better capabilities. And one is called client-side data cache. We'll be talking about that in more detail today. Another one is local storage, which is really built on JavaScript's local storage capability, the ability for you to store data either in a web browser or in a PhoneGap app, so that, you know, think of it as a scratch pad, and that's all done through programmatic means, and I'll give you some examples and demonstrations of that when we come back from DevCon. And last but not least is a newer feature called SQLite database, where it allows you to actually on the fly download SQLite databases, generate and download them, and then manipulate that information locally. And again, this is only when you're building using PhoneGap, because the SQLite database engine is included in the PhoneGap infrastructure. And again, we'll be covering that one after local storage, after we get back, and that one's got a lot of great potential. So we ran through each of the different ones in our last meeting and kind of talked about the different advantages of them and how they work, which does synchronization not. But today I want to focus on the client-side data cache, which is was a feature added fairly recently to address a very specific issue, and that is when people were building mobile disconnected apps, they needed to have some, I call it secondary table data available for their apps. So for instance, in a list, you might be editing an item in a list, and let's say there's department is one of the rows, and you want to be able to have a list of departments that you can show the individual to actually allow them to select from. Well, previously, before client-side data cache came online, you would actually have another list control that would manage that data, and then you could connect the two together. And that worked fine and was very powerful, but it was kind of overkill because that second list was really a read-only cache structure, meaning that you needed to be able to extract and download the data from the back-end system, but you really weren't going to edit that data. You were only going to go in and read that information and have it available to support other functions, mainly editing data and the primary list control. So the team realized that people were putting a lot of lists in their system they didn't need to, so they came up with this technique, and I'm going to actually walk through and show you a bit more about that today. So just from a high level, what is going on is it's kind of a one-way trip, meaning that you have a back-end data source, and I'll show you that that can either be SQL, it could be some static data, it could also be a XBasic function that's actually maybe making a web service call or something along those lines. But the Alpha App Server in the UX component is going to request that from the Alpha App Server, and then the system will download that information to the UX component and behind the scenes store that in a JSON representation that can then be used by other controls in the system. And in fact, at the DevCon training, we're going to show an example of using this where I have I'm editing records and I need to be able to have an inspection type. And with that, I was able to create a client-side data cache so that dynamically I could update that at any time so that I could always have essentially pulling from a database for that secondary data there. Now the cool thing about this is all done through point and click, so there was no programming required to make this work. It's all done through the UX component, and I will show that in a few minutes on how to do that. The other thing that's really powerful about this also is the fact that you can control through Action JavaScript and through the setting up of the information when that information is pulled. So for instance, you can determine and have it pulled automatically from the back-end source and set up your client-side data cache, or you can control that through Action JavaScript. And again, I'll show you that in a few minutes also. But the powerful thing and the most important to realize is, as it is said, a cache, it's really meant as a read-only set of data that's available to your different components on the client side. And again, the handling of it is done all through Alpha and in terms of doing it from there. And so you're not going to be writing any of this information or modifying it, but you're merely going to be bringing it down and using it instead of having to create a list component, which, again, very powerful, but overkill for what we're trying to do from there. So I'm just going to spend the next few minutes kind of walking through an example UX. It's actually available. This UX is available online. I'll give you the link in a few minutes to show you a little bit and talk a little bit more about the client-side data cache. So I'm going to pop back over into my development environment. And for people who are new to Alpha and just kind of looking in, this is my Alpha development environment. I'm on the Web Projects Control Panel. That's where 90% of the work is done now when you're developing mobile and web applications. And you'll see I have a whole set of, in this case, web components that's available right here. We also have this shows you the different types of things that are in my system. But what we're going to be doing, and let me go to there and go down to cache. What is it? Oh, which one is it? Let's see. I had it all ready to go. Sorry there. Bear with me real quick. I want to look at something I wanted to remember. Too much time spending on getting ready for the, there it is, data cache. Okay. So we have data cache. Okay, so I'm going to open up this. And again, in a few minutes, Dave, actually, it's in the, this component can be downloaded from the Alpha 5 V12 release notes. And you just search for client-side cache, we can catch to that. So let me go ahead and show you what this looks like. And this is a demonstration that was put together by the development team to kind of show it. So we have basically here a list control on my page and a set of buttons right here. And these buttons basically will, and you'll notice nothing is showing in right now. So now I can click here, and what's going to happen, you'll see in a moment that the customers is red and populating this list control. So this is classic Northwind customer information, and you have that information here. Same thing here. If I click orders and I click there, you'll notice that my list control is updating with that information. But what's going on is when I'm clicking these, it's actually extracting and pulling the data from the database and storing it locally on this. So the nice thing is that now I can access and use this information without ever having to connect back into the database. And in fact, I can click refresh all, and you'll see it's doing a refresh, and it's going to pull from all of those different data sources, be able to do it. In these case, these three right here are SQL sources, but we could actually also pull from a function, and I'll show you that in a few moments. But now what's going on is Alpha is using local storage. We talked about local storage, but Alpha is using local storage to store that JSON data locally. And you can actually see the information there, especially when you're using PhoneGap to be able to see the data from there. So if I delete local storage there and I read the customer information, you'll notice that there was like a little circle, because it was actually because the local storage didn't exist, because I deleted that information, it basically made a call back to the server to grab my cache data and bring it down. And again, you have complete control over how that works. So let's go ahead and walk into this UX and show first, how am I telling it what kind of client-side data caches I need? And then look at some of these buttons here to show you the action JavaScript that allows you to control the behavior of the information. So I'm going to go into the design, and one thing I think it's very important for you to realize is that the client-side data cache is not done at the project level, it's actually done at the UX level. And I have that in my diagram here, is that the UX component is actually the entity that's kind of grabbing the data and bringing it down and then managing it. So you'll notice that when I'm going to go ahead and edit the client-side data cache, I'm going to be inside my UX that's going to use it, and that's the first and foremost. So if you'll go, if you'll look in here, we have our, and people for new, these are different controls and events that we can manage. Here's the layout of my screen. We had those buttons, a list control, and some other buttons here. And we also have our parameters for each of these elements here. To access client-side data cache, we actually click Menu, Client-side data cache editor. So again, as I mentioned, the UX is responsible for managing this data, and built into the UX is this, the UX builder that we're using right here is a handy tool, and it's under the menu drop down here, and it's called Client-Side Data Cache Editor. And that opens up a dialog box. And so you can see I already have defined a series of client-side data caches. One for customers, one for orders, one for order items. I also have an XBasic version one where it'll actually generate this data based upon an XBasic function callback, and another one for SQL query here. And I can click one of these here, and let's say customers, and I can just click here and say preview data. And it will show me the data. Now what's important too, as we've talked about before, is that JSON really is the method for which we manage data on the client side. It's very powerful, very easy to read, and all of our tools are very well built around using that as the information. So you'll see we have a JSON representation of our customers table in the database, and I'll show you how you set up that. But you'll see customer ID, and here's the customer ID, company name, etc. And in this case, we have an array of these objects, because here's the first record, here's the second record, third record, etc. So you can actually, before you even do anything, is do a quick read to see if you're getting the data you want back from that standpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and select customers, and I'm going to click on here, Edit Item. So now what I'm in is the actual editor. So first you'll see there are different types. In this case, this is a SQL query, but you could have actually a nested SQL query where it'll actually pull back complex data, say order and order details at one time. You could also have static data, which is perfectly viable, and also very, very powerful XBasic, where, and I'll show you that in a moment, where you're actually making a call back to the server, running some function to populate your data from there. But let's focus first on this customer. So customers is a SQL query. So we've given it a name. The item type is SQL query. This is just selecting my different types that are available. I could pass in arguments. This is very powerful if I want to filter what I have on my client-side cache. So maybe I want only certain region, like let's say I have a client in a certain region and you only ever want to bring down customers. And that's important as your systems get bigger, as you handle more and more data. The more compact you can make your offline data, the better. If you don't need to bring down and store data that's really not necessary, it's best to do that. As you can see, we've used our connection string to do so, and we're using a custom SQL statement, and we're just defining a SQL statement right here. And Alpha actually will walk you through building this SQL statement, so you don't have to do it yourself. So all this is doing is saying, hey, select all of the rows from customers. Now, very important, it gives you some option. You'll notice right here it says delay query until explicit refresh or read. And that's very critical. If that's unchecked, the moment this UX loads up on the client-side system, it's going to make a call back to the server and attempt to update the client-side data cache. It just does it automatically. And that may be the default behavior that you want. But if you really want to manage this process, you can actually say delay query until explicit refresh or read, meaning that this is not going to load this up until you act on it and make that call. And I'll show you the call in a few moments. It's action JavaScript there. And then you can have some information about what security groups here. One that's very important is store where. You'll see there's local storage file system preferred. The reason this works is like if I am building a system that's going to be PhoneGap, I want to use file system, because file system we have a massive amount of information available, or of size on the local device. If we're doing like a web one, we're using local storage, which is built into the web browser available there. And then what file system preferred means saying, hey, if you're on PhoneGap, it's going to know it has access to the file system, so use that. If you're not, go ahead and just use local storage. So it's smart enough to like basically pick which is where you want to put the data. And again, once it's there, it handles interfacing with it. So it really, for you, it's a black box, but this gives you a little control on that from that standpoint there. One thing is very important is realize if you're using local storage, and we talked about this last time, that if you're bringing down a ton of data, there's about a 5 megabyte limit on local storage in web browsers. So there is certain levels, and that's where the filtering comes in, is that you don't want to bring back a couple million records if not necessary, because you may run out of local storage space and not be able to achieve that from there. So it also gives you some action, like if anything happens, like it fails, you can give the user a warning, etc. But this is all point and click. Basically, I'm telling where I'm getting it, a SQL query. I'm defining that SQL query, and in this case, I'm telling it to delay until I actually want it to be from there. Now, I also wanted to show you real quick another option is using XBasic. So I can open this up, and you'll see we have told it XBasic, and there's this function name. And again, this also is set to delay query until I explicitly call that there. So what will happen is instead of making a SQL query against a backend database, what it's going to do is do a function call to XBasic data. And let me go ahead and show you that. I'll go ahead and cancel this. I go over into my XBasic functions, and here's the function that will be called. And as you can see, it's very simple. All it's really doing is, and it gives you some instructions that actually helps you build this. Here's field 1, alpha, field 2, 1, 2, 3, and then we return the information back from this. So fairly simple. This is basically just hard-coded in this function here. But this could be very sophisticated. This could make calls to multiple databases. This could actually make a web service call out to an external service, grab that data and present it to it. So there's a lot of flexibility around this capability about doing it with XBasic, and it really makes it easy to do. And again, when you create that function, it will give you examples that you can use from there. So let me go back into my client-side data cache here. So those are the two primary. And again, if you want to see anything, you can just click on it and say preview data, and it will bring up that preview data from that standpoint there. So now that we've defined our client-side data cache, we're done. Basically, anytime we refresh any of these client-side data cache, it's going to either run the function for XBasic, or it's going to make a call to the backend server, call the database, and bring down the information that you need. So once you've set it up, kind of set the parameters of what you want to do, it will handle it from then on. Now it's just a matter of when you want that to occur. Do you want that to happen automatically? And in the case like here, you can say, turn this off and it will immediately grab it, or do you want to control it? So let's go ahead and go into our buttons here. So just to kind of as a refresher, we have our working preview here, and you'll notice it's empty here. And now I'm going to say read customers, and it's going to call that. I can also read the XP data, and that's going to make a call back to the server. And you remember that alpha, field 1, field 2, that's what's doing there. If I delete local storage and read XBasic, you'll notice that it's rereading that data and then re-updating this, although that looks a little deceptive from that standpoint there. So let me show you some of these buttons and what's going on in these buttons. So the first one is, let's look at read customers. So I'm going to double click on that button to look at what it's doing. Now you'll notice there's no JavaScript in here because Alpha has built-in action JavaScript that allows you to easily manage the client-side data cache. So I'm going to go ahead and edit this action by clicking on it and clicking on the edit action. You'll see that we have a couple different actions for this. So I'm going to go ahead and open that. So the things we can do is refresh the data items, the data, or read multiple data items. And they actually operate a little different in each time what it does. This performs an AJAX callback to the server to refresh the data. This will read multiple data items. In fact, it will do all of those. And then the read data is, this will read the data from a cached data item. So refresh is your biggest fan, meaning it's going to grab and make a call back to the server. Read data just says, hey, I'm going to go do that. And so you'll notice that what I'm saying is read the data, so read the local data cache. The data item I want in this case is customers, and then once I've done that, I've actually have the opportunity to say, do some little JavaScript. And this is really cool and a neat feature that they added to the system. So what's going to happen here is that when I click that button, it's going to read the local data cache and run this JavaScript. And in this JavaScript, it basically does a cool function called set list columns and populate it. So I didn't have to define my list up front for every type of data cache. You'll notice when I clicked on the different buttons, it changed itself because Alpha's added this cool little feature called set list columns data, which will say which one, the data to use, and then in this case, options saying there's 5 columns to it. So instead of having to build a list control that exactly matches it, this does it dynamically. So when I click on that button, it's going to read the data from the local data cache, and then it's going to run this to actually populate that list control so you visibly see what's going on there. So you're not limited just using lists. You can do a whole bunch of other things. You could actually add JavaScript to do a whole bunch of other things that you may want to do with that data. Now the other key button here is this refresh all. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and let me go ahead and show you that real quick. So again, if I read here, it's going to read the local cache, throw the information in there. And here I'm going to click refresh all. You'll see that it's kind of going, and there's a wait button right here because this is what's going back and actually reading the data from the server. So then it's in your local cache. So it's actually not updating the list. All it's doing is bringing all this data down to local so that now I can use, you'll notice that I can instantly click these things and they work just instantaneous because all of this is on my local system there. If I delete local storage, now I've gotten rid of it and I click read customers, watch what happens. You'll notice that there's a little twirly thing going on there because what it's doing is it realizes, oh, you know what? I don't have anything in my local cache for that, so I better go up to the server and grab from that. Whereas this is what I'm saying is refresh that all. So let's go ahead and show you this button for refresh all here. So I'm going to click on this button here and I'm going to double click on it. You'll see I'm first displaying a wait message because I know it may take a moment because I'm doing multiple items. Then I'm going to click on this client-side data cache actions, and you'll notice in here we have refresh data items. So I'm going to click on there. Again, this will perform an AJAX callback to the server to refresh the data in one or more cached items. I'm going to go ahead and click here. You'll notice that it is showing me which of the items are available. I do have the option to just say, hey, refresh all of them. I don't care, you know, just whatever is there, which is kind of nice. If I wanted to, I could explicitly change this just to say refresh just a couple of them if you so choose from there. And then in this case, there's no on complete action. It just does that refresh. So when we click that button, it automatically forces the system to run up to the server or run the XBasic function on the server, grab the data, and refresh your local data down there. And then you're off to the races from there. Now, just to kind of finish up our discussion right here, you'll notice I had a delete local storage. I'm going to go ahead and double click on that to show you what it's doing. And in case this is just a little piece of action JavaScript, which is saying there's built-in alpha. So what we're going to do is get the data and then do a delete keys. And what this does is basically deletes all of the local storage content so that we can then simulate refreshing it in there. And these are just built-in action JavaScript, alpha JavaScript command. And if you want to find out more information about that, you could, like, for instance, this _ls. If you click down here into insert UX component method when you're in the text mode for this, and then you can go in here and say ls. Let's do ls locals. Oh, I wonder if it has their which one is it? It's a dialog delete. Let's say if it's keys. Oh, it's not in here. I'll have to talk to you know what? I'll have to talk to Sarah. I don't know if we have these. These look like internal. Well, you can download and copy these pieces here, but these are built-in alpha commands that are available. And I'll just check. I'll follow up with Sarah on where the documentation is for these here. In fact, we could try it online. Let's try this. Let's see. Well, we'll go on that a little later. But all this is doing is when I click on this local storage, it's basically flushing out and deleting the stuff on my local storage. So it forces me to then download the information. In fact, let me show you that one more time real quick, and then we'll wrap this up. So if I delete my local storage, I now have nothing in the local storage. I can click Read Customers. Watch what happens when I click Read Customers. You'll notice that there was a little circle thing that showed up, a little subtle there. But the reason that was doing it is because it was actually making a call to my server to download the data. And now notice when I click Read Customers, watch what happens. Nothing occurred, or you don't see that little circle, because it actually knows that that data is local. It looked in the local storage and said, hey, my data is there, so I'm going to update it. So you don't see anything happening here, but what's happening is when I click here, it's reading it from local storage and rewriting this grid right here. I wonder if I do that. Yep, you'll see it kind of changes just subtly there. So it handles all that for me. And then if I click delete local storage and hit read customers again, you'll notice I see that come back because it has to store that into local storage. Again, the whole point of this is that once I've read this customer data in, I now can use that data moving forward without any connection to the server. And so all this customer data is local from that standpoint. But I still have the control if I want to say, you know what, it's time for me to refresh this. So for instance, let's say it is some like pricing information, or more importantly, like catalog information. You could bring that down in local storage and then behind the scenes once a week do a forced refresh saying, oh, you know, it's been about, you know, the local storage is here. It's been a week since I've updated, so I'm going to do a refresh. So you always have the most current because it doesn't change day to day. And that's up to you to kind of determine that. Or if you want to, and if there's not a big deal, you can always tell it to every time you open up the app to bring down that local storage information to local storage. So therefore you won't have that issue of anything being out of date. But it's up to you. You have that control. And that's up to you. And you know, when people start writing offline disconnected apps like PhoneGap, you may want to control that in more detail, saying, I want to wait till the person's logged in to do all these client-side data caches and other things like that. It gives you the hooks to do that from that standpoint there. So that is a quick introduction to local storage. Remember, it is a one-way trip. You can't edit the data once it's down. Secondly, it uses the UX component, and specifically when you're on the UX component, the menu client-side data cache editor. This can either be a database or a XBasic function to bring down, or static data. And last but not least is there's a set of action JavaScript that allows you to control this process to tell it like to explicitly bring down the data or to read the data from local storage and do something with it. And so that is a quick and dirty introduction to client-side data cache. You'll see that the client-side data cache more and more will be built into the other components. So for instance, you'll see in the form view control, if you have a list control in a form view, you can actually say, oh, you know what, dynamically update this list with the information from the client-side data cache without having to build that specifically. So, oh, someone's got their their speaker on. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn this now back to our friend Dave, and
Excellent.
we can look and see if there are questions, and if questions on this or any other items.
Excellent. Hey, just back in what you were just showing, you had two other buttons that
Oh, yes.
you didn't explain. The show directory.
Yeah.
What are those?
Yeah, well, let me go ahead and show you what that is if you are doing this in PhoneGap. I didn't really go into those because you really have to be doing it in PhoneGap.
On a phone, basically.
Yeah, on a phone, you can actually create and delete directories and put information in those. So let me go ahead and just show you that. For instance, the function show directory, if I double click on there, basically what this does is it grabs the directory contents of a certain directory, and in this case it pushes it into the it was just beyond the scope of what we could do today. So these two things, what I can do is actually read information from my local directory in a PhoneGap app, because it's a file system that's available to me, and I can even delete that directory if I so choose and have that ability. So that was just beyond here. There is documentation in the actually, let me go ahead and go alpha, and I'll show you because it's got anywhere V12 release notes. Okay. If you go to this and then go, let's see if we do that there. Oh, sorry, my apologies, everybody. Find cache. There's this video series, including this component, is available. So let me go ahead and copy that. I'm going to put that into the chat room window to everybody. So if you go there and search for the term cache, what will happen is you'll find this, and actually in there, Selwyn in this case demonstrates that directory and what that's doing there. Again, meant to be only done through PhoneGap. That's why I didn't cover it today. So good observation.
Excellent. So a bunch of questions on today's topic, which is
excellent.
Let's start sort of at the top here. This one isn't specifically to that, except that you were talking about PhoneGap. And
yes.
So this one had the question was Alpha Launch, which you may be familiar with. That's sort of that new application that's in the Apple, in the iTunes Store and in Google
yes.
Play for launching applications. So what's the difference between, say, Alpha Launch and the PhoneGap shell template? And the big question they have is, which should I use to help me getting started in PhoneGap?
I would use the PhoneGap shell app.
Right.
And the reason why is if you're just starting, you're still kind of in development mode. And for people who have not used it before, with the PhoneGap shell app is really a really neat introduction. When you're developing in PhoneGap, let's say I go, hey, this looks great. I'm ready to go to PhoneGap. Well, what I would do is I would click on my PhoneGap here. I would point to that component, put in my PhoneGap credentials, and then, the other settings, hit it, and then it would send it up to PhoneGap, compile it, and then it would give me a QR code where I could download that. So that works great. Very simple, very effective, awesome. But the downside is that if you are doing multiple iterations, you don't want to have to sit there and build and wait for it every time. It could even make, it only takes about 10 to 20 seconds to do it, but that adds up over time. So Alpha has developed, and we should actually do a whole discussion and show that online, what's called the PhoneGap shell. And to start out, if you're going to create one, you just click New, you go to the Alpha Web Control Panel, you click New, Web Component, UX, and then we have actually built a pre-created UX. And then what you do is you'll actually build that using PhoneGap. Now, the cool thing, and there's a great video on it, we'll find and get that online here. The cool thing about the PhoneGap shell is this, is that once I've built that and I want to include all the PhoneGap options, like if I'm going to be reading the camera and stuff, I can install that on my development mobile device, either Android or iOS. Now that I have that on my local device, what I can merely do is instead of going through the build process, in that I could actually load this UX into the shell. So I don't actually have to build the UX. I basically load it into the shell where it will call the alpha, my development machine. It has to be on the same network. It calls my machine and loads up this UX, and then I can run it as if it's a PhoneGap app because it's running inside the PhoneGap shell. And we'll do, I think what we should do is a session on this because it's really a powerful, powerful tool. So the cool thing about this, and this is the most powerful that you need to do, is once you've set that up and you have it running, if I go in and change something in this UX, all I have to do is hit live preview because it basically prepares the file, and then on my PhoneGap shell I say refresh, and boom, immediately the stuff I've done right here shows up on that. So I don't have to go through the build cycle of that. So I would definitely work on understanding and mastering the PhoneGap shell. It's really not too hard. The only tricky part about it is making sure that your mobile device is properly set up to call and look at your development machine. So once you got that parameter set, you're great. And I'll tell you, it will accelerate your development time by an order of magnitude because you completely erase that whole build case capability. The only other thing I like to mention when people are doing PhoneGap shell is that let's say I'm building this UX and it's going to capture images, and I've got a list control, and then I've got built-in image capture, etc. When I build my PhoneGap build for the PhoneGap, let me go ahead and do that. Let's say I'm building my shell. Well, what I have to do is make sure that I've selected all of the potential plugins that I might need for that UX, because that UX is not being built through PhoneGap, so it's just making the assumption that the shell has the plugin that it needs to be able to use it, maybe accessing the camera or reading barcodes or things like that. So the tricky part is just know which PhoneGap plugins, build your PhoneGap shell with those enabled, and boom, then from then on you can just stay inside the UX and those features and functions will be available for you. So these two buttons, show directory, delete directory, won't work in this environment unless I do a PhoneGap. But if I were to do a PhoneGap shell and run this within the shell, I could exercise those and be able to do things along those lines. So back to your question, master the PhoneGap shell. It will be an incredible return on your investment of time to master that capability.
Excellent. All right, a bunch of other questions here. The first one is, how can you first of all, does the client-side data cache, does it work when you have embedded UX components, or is it just on the top-level component?
That's a good point. My assumption is it would work fine on any level. The only problem is the top level may not have awareness of that client-side data cache. So, so that's a really good question. That's something I'd have to do a little research, just pop off my top of my head. But I would assume we always have kind of usually a main UX, so I tend to almost always put, you know, my key items like client-side data cache at that top level. The only tricky part is when you're building a UX, it may not have awareness of a client-side data cache in like a parent UX. But I'd have to double check and investigate that to find out.
Okay, thanks. So just heard back from our documentation person. In fact, those functions that we're using, those methods have not been documented, but we will document them. So
there goes a free beer for me at the DevCon.
There we go. Perfect.
There we go. I'm searching for those. I'm playing Pokemon Go, but for documentation stuff that's missing.
Excellent.
That's my thing,
perfect.
You know.
So we have a couple questions along the line about when you say that it's read-only, how read-only are we talking about for the client-side data cache? Here's the first one. So does that mean you can't edit stuff? Can you edit stuff in local storage, or is it you just can't edit stuff in local storage with the client-side data cache? What would you use maybe instead of the client-side data cache if you wanted to do some editing of the data, maybe to synchronize it later on?
Oh yeah, you would use the method you would use then is local storage, and local storage is built in. It's JavaScript 101. It's built in it's really not an alpha thing. It's part of the JavaScript standard and part of the mobile or the browser standards there. And there's a set you can get. Basically, how it's a key value pair, meaning that you say, okay, let's call it A. I'm going to put in for key A this piece of data, and it's just a JavaScript object, it could be text, it could be a full object, it could be pretty extensive there. And then you can delete that item or you can edit that item. So essentially it's just programmatically setting, think of it as an array that is local, that you can set the data and then modify it, look it up, etc. there. So if you're doing that, obviously local storage. Client-side data caches, really treat it as a black box. It's sort of it's doing the same thing, but it's doing it for you. And the more important thing about client-side data cache is that by calling it cache, it's not meant to be edited, so it's not intended for that. And then secondly, more importantly, and you'll see this in the DevCon training, is that we use that concept so that, like, when you're saying, oh, okay, for this control on my detail view or on my form view, I want to use a list to edit that, and I want to use this client-side data cache as the values for that list. So it really opens up a lot of really simple and easy ways to point and click and build very complex interfaces, and it relies on that client-side data cache being there, and also, more importantly, read-only. So play with local storage. There's tons of, if you just say local storage JavaScript in Google, there's tons of examples that you can use, and they work really well. I mean, it's a great method, but it'll be up to you to code it.
All right, but there's another way that you can do it without coding. I think that Sarah Mitchell may have one-upped you this time. Our documentation person. It's just written in saying, yeah, the list control. Use the list control. You can do all kinds of data manipulation in the list control with actions JavaScripting. And if you just want it, like the client-side data cache doesn't have an interface. So in other words, you present it within
other things
list or something, right? But the list control does. But if you don't want to see the list control, you can make it a hidden object, but still use it as for its data holding capabilities. So take a look at the list control. I think would also be a helpful thing to take a look at that one.
And this is Dean thinking out loud, so take it with a grain of salt. This is not what development has said. So I always have to put that caveat out there. And you're like, oh, we just went off the rails there. Stop, Dean, stop. I get a side message from Dave in my Skype saying, cut it out. Really, Alpha is moving more and more towards the MVC, model view controller concepts. I mean, that's standard in terms of how you build these things. So again, the history is when they created the list control, it did two things. It managed data, and it also did data representation, meaning that it displayed the information to the user. Well, that's great, but sometimes you don't need the user interface. Thus, for this, we just need a client-side data cache where we just need something that manages data really well and then can be referenced by other controls that will do the actual representation of that information. So this is all part of the maturity and migration and the evolution of Alpha to where down the road I anticipate there'll be more of a master kind of controller that will take care of managing the data aspects, and then you'll have just interface elements on top of it to present those to the user. So that's all part of this, and it's happening very, very quickly, and it's very exciting, and it really opens up an amazing amount of capabilities for people using the tool.
That's great. So so far the data we've been looking at has been text and numbers, but someone had a question of can it include images? Could it even include maybe PDF files or something like that as data that you store?
This is really focused on if the images are in base64 included in like the data stream. Yes, there are other action JavaScript methods, and really in the PhoneGap world, to do the managing of data. So let me see if I can find one of those right here. PhoneGap file download. So the idea to think about this is that the client-side data cache, think of it more of as really focused around feeding stuff to list controls and other things like that. If you're actually managing media stuff, then you're going to want to be in the PhoneGap world, and you're going to want to use the combination of PhoneGap file and file system actions kind of scenario. So those will handle the moving of data, and you can trigger those in your app to say, go up and grab these files from the server and bring them down into my local file system. So a good example of that, and I've used them before, is we have a major telecom service company in the Middle East that basically in the morning their workers with their handhelds, they sync up, it brings down their work orders, it brings down all the information they need, and it actually also brings down PDF files and Excel files and other things that have data that they'll need when they're on site. And then they go off, they do their thing, they can access it within the mobile device. Then at the end of the day, once they sync back up, it's actually smart enough to remove those files when they're no longer needed from the local device. And they're using a combination of the file download and file system actions. You're kind of managing them outside of the database environment from that standpoint. Now, there's probably within the database pointers to those files. So you can say, okay, give me a list of items I'm going to do from the database that I'm going to need today, and then you trigger and bring down those files there. But you really wouldn't really do that file management stuff inside the client-side data cache. Now, who knows? I mean, Alpha's very busy from a development side. They might create a file data cache in the future. You know, you never know what they're up to in the back offices there. But for now, look at the file download and file system actions to look at those pieces there.
Yeah, exactly. And I know that when we were working with the client-side data cache with someone else who was dealing with lots of images, that was absolutely the way to go, was to put them into the file system itself.
Yes.
Part of the issue is that the client-side data cache is loaded into memory. This is something we don't usually talk about, but besides the local memory, which has got the 5 megabyte limit in terms of what you're allowed to leave there after you leave the application and come back, often the device itself has a working memory. And there is a limit to how much you can put in the working memory. Now, this varies wildly from device to device, so we don't usually throw out a number like that, but we do say that the best practice when handling files and large images and videos is to put them in the file system and don't just encode them and put them into the data cache. Unless they're little small things, thumbnails, icons, things like that take up very little space. That would be different. But I would say, like for PDF documents, absolutely right.
Great.
Can the data added to the cache? Oh, yeah, here is one. Can you add additional data to the data cache once you've loaded it in? And I think the answer to that is no, I don't.
No. It's going to do a pull. The only way you may want to do that is maybe you make another call to your function, pass it arguments, and then, but that's all going to happen on the server and be brought down to there. Again, not really meant to be manipulated in any way, shape, or form on the local device.
So great question here. I don't know if you know the answer offhand, but okay, so you have that refresh all button. But what if you wanted to make your app smart to say, well, I don't want them to, or if they press that button, I don't want it to do anything if the device is offline, like there's or Wi-Fi.
Great question, and I get that a lot. So let me go ahead and this is I'm going to go ahead and add a new action here, and I'm just going to say it's a little piece of JavaScript here. So this is my JavaScript editor. This is equivalent to like clicking on text mode there. There is a method connected. It's called getOnlineStatus. Dialog object dot under getOnlineStatus, and this will tell you what is going on and see whether you are on, if you are online or not, meaning you have internet connectivity. There's another one which is get server status, which does one even more, where it says not only am I online, but I can also talk to the server out there, which is maybe overkill, but because Alpha servers never go down, so you always know it's going to be available. But hey, someone might have tripped over a line in the office, or unplugged something. Yeah, it might be Delta Airlines or someone like that. Power surge, whatever happens there. So this is how you do that. By the way, there's another one. It talks in there. There's on connection change, so we can actually detect when a connection change occurs. So look for getOnlineStatus. You can just in the list you can click status, and you'll see there's like this one, server is available, etc. And between those you can fire that. If it's true, then go ahead and run the cache update. If it's false, ignore it or maybe notify the person you can't do that at that time. So that's how you handle getting that online status.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So another question about how do you edit your cache data and sync it back to the database? The answer is you don't do it. You use the list control to do that, not the client-side data cache. Oh, Sarah pointed out, and we've pasted this into the chat window, information about the PhoneGap shell that you were talking about.
Yes, thank you.
So there's a how to create the PhoneGap shell. There is a documentation article about it. I pasted it to the chat window. You could also go to our documentation system and just type in PhoneGap space shell, and you should be able to
Yeah,
find
I
it.
can't iterate enough. Thank you, Sarah, because by mastering that and using that, literally hours and hours of development
It,
time
it
you're going to
saves you a
save.
ton of time. And yeah, sometimes it's 20 seconds to rebuild it, but sometimes it's a minute. And when you
Yeah.
get down to that fine control of, on this Android device, this needs to move over 5 pixels. No, wait, this
Ah,
needs to move back 2 pixels. And you're just getting this final touches on each one of those minutes. Is so frustrating versus just hitting the refresh button and having it work right away.
yeah,
So
because you
that's
not
a
only have the 20
huge time saver.
seconds, but you have to download it and
Yeah,
install
you
it.
have to download it, you have to install it, then you have to run it again. So it's not.
And again, thank you. I believe Bob Moore drove that, and it was
Bob
probably
Moore did
because he
that.
was about to shoot himself for having to wait for his builds, and he said, "I'm going to just fix this." I love that.
Necessity is the
Nobody
mother
asked me to do it. I'm just going to do it.
Yeah, that was absolutely needed. Um, let's see what else we've got. Nothing else. Someone else says my audio is coming through not very well. I don't know if that's the case. Maybe I was too far away from the mic. What
We
else
did
we
have
got?
a question that was submitted. There were actually two
Yeah,
questions.
there were two.
Um,
Yeah, let's take a
yeah,
look.
there. Let's see which one. Let me pull it up. I'm sorry. What was the first question? Okay, bear with me. There's two questions. One about uh, displaying images, Amazon S3,
Yep.
and then the
Well,
second one
and I've got another
was,
one, a good one here too as well.
oh yeah, there it is. It's copying and pasting from UXs.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good one here. So, uh, the person wrote in and said, "Listen, I built a UX control like this, and I'm creating a UX control that's very similar to it. What I want to be able to do is move some of my pre-made buttons that may have pretty complex actions from one to the other. So I'm going to go ahead and create. I'm in my development environment. This is my existing UX. I'm going to go ahead and here, and I'm going to create new UX." And I'm going to create a new UX system here. So it's going to bring that up here. So controls. So I can now go back into my other one and I can say, okay, let's go ahead and this button read customers. I'm going to sit there, right click on it and say copy control to clipboard. So this pulls up the representation of that, pops there. I now have that on my clipboard. I can go over here and I can go to menu, paste controls from clipboard, and now I paste from the clipboard and click OK. So now this button has moved from here to here. And so you'll see there's my client side. But in this case, you'll notice, well, there's a problem. When I copied that over, it did copy over the code, but I don't have any client-side data cache items because they're defined at the UX level. So that happens. There's other elements of, when you build it, you may have back-end XBasic functions, like if it's a callback, functions you have to manually. So I highly recommend if you're at about the 80%, the one thing I like to do is go to my control, say duplicate that. Let me go to that a little slower. I click on the control and I right click on it and I say duplicate. And that brings up a little question. I can say, okay, my data cache 2, and I click duplicate. And then say, great, I've just duplicated that data cache. So now I have my original one and my new one. And what I do is I go in there and just quickly delete the stuff I don't want. Now, the benefit of this is any XBasic code I've created is in here. Any JavaScript functions I've created are in here. Any other server side or client side. And more importantly, these controls, like for instance with the client side data cache editor and the JavaScript and everything underneath the covers, all comes over. So, it depends. You probably already have started to lay out the other ones, but if you have these, I find it's easier just to duplicate where the controls are. Everything's kind of wired up and ready to go. Delete what you don't want, which should only take a few minutes, and then start adding back in what you want. And that's the best way, because I have noticed that if you have a fairly complex, like let me go ahead and show you an example of that. I'm going to go ahead and put in here a map component. So let me go ahead and do that. It's a really good question. We really appreciate you asking that question. I'm going to put in a map component, and I'm going to add a button here. And I'm going to go ahead and delete all these buttons here because we don't need them for this example here. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to go to other controls and add a button. So now I have a button on there, and I'm going to call it map it, and I'm going to go ahead and double click on the button. I'm going to add a new action, and what this is a Google Map Method UX component. So I want to draw a map. The map ID is map, and the action name is add a marker to the map. And I'm just going to put, 1000 Congress Street, Austin, Texas. So we'll just do that. Okay. So now when I run this, let's do a working preview. If I map it, you'll notice that, boom, there's my map of Austin, specifically 1000 Congress, and there's UT, and that's actually right there at the Capitol. Anyway, that said, this is a fairly complex set of JavaScript. In fact, let's go ahead and go into it, and this is the action JavaScript. I could go in and make changes to it, but I can convert this into text mode. So I can click on it and say text mode, and it's going to say, hey, this is a one-way trip, pal. I'm going to convert it, but don't expect it to go back. So I do that. So here is the JavaScript that has been developed and is part of it. But you'll see if you look down here, there is also JavaScript function decorations. So this is also created for me also. And so these can get fairly complex. It's actually doing a fair amount of stuff. And the more sophisticated things you're doing, the more it's writing more code behind the scenes. And we have noticed if you go and copy this control to the clipboard, put it on, sometimes for the more complex actions, it doesn't necessarily transfer over. That's why I say your best bet is to go ahead and take the original control UX component, duplicate it, delete what you don't want, because deletion takes a matter of a few moments, and then start building back around those controls that you really like. That's a sort of a tried and true. You're going to know it's going to work fine, and it may take a little bit more time, but it actually takes less time because you don't get weird things because it didn't copy over correctly. So great question, something we've seen before, and really appreciate the question.
Excellent. Here's a quick question that I think we can answer in the 3 minutes that are remaining. This person has a application that they use in a dispatch environment, so they might be tracking multiple things on the screen at the same time. And they said in a desktop app, it's not unusual to have like 3 or 4 windows open at once, each with separate sets of data that you can navigate separately.
Correct.
He wants to know whether or not he can do that in his application, UX control, and have like all 3 different views of all pulling against the same data source, and just be able to navigate them separately.
Yes, absolutely. Alpha has 2 concepts. One is called the panel navigator and the panel layout. Do we have oh, you know what? Let's try. Maybe I can create it from scratch. We only have a few minutes here, but I want to kind of cover this. It's a great question. Okay. So I don't think I have a reach in, but I'm going to go ahead. I've created a UX control here, and I'm going down here to the panels. So the panel concept is very important. There's 2 types of, essentially, there's panel cards. That's what actually holds the content. So think of it as a box on the screen, or a panel that you're seeing on the screen. A panel navigator will show one thing at a time. So it'll only show one panel. So for instance, when you're doing mobile apps, it's that swipe gesture. I'm going from one panel to the next to the next. But a panel layout is actually very powerful because you can put multiple panels on the screen at one time. So let me go ahead and let's see if there's a quick panel that's available. Let's do that. Insert predetermined. Okay, there. Great. Cool. Watch this. Okay. So in here is I have a panel layout. That's the top level. And within there, I have a header and I have a set of panel cards right here. So the panel layout, and I have a footer. So I've got 2 panel cards. So now when I go and do working preview, you'll notice I have my header, and then I have my panel here and my panel here. Now, if I wanted to, I could go in here and say, you know what? I'm going to add a 3rd panel card, and I'm going to go ahead and add that there. And I'm going to go in here and put in some text, just say hello. Now, notice what happens when I do that. Now I can have 3 areas, first one, second one, and the third one. And I can do some very sophisticated thing. I can nest panel layouts within panel layouts. So I could actually, I'm going to just do that real quick and let's see if this works. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get rid of my panel card number 3, And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go here and I'm going to add a container, a panel layout container. So it's a nested one. And in here, I'm going to add 2 panel cards. And I'm going to add another panel card here. So this one, I'm going to go ahead and put in some static, oh no, there I want static text. I'll go hello. And then this one, I'm going to put in some other static text. I'm going to go hello too. Okay. And this one, I want to do top to bottom. Okay. So now look what I've built here. You'll notice now I have my first 2 panel cards, but now I have a panel layout with 2 sub-panel cards here. So as you can see, I start to build that kind of dispatch screen. Now what's great is in each of these, I can now say, hey, you know what? Let's go ahead and insert in here a list control, a grid control. What's nice is I can put an embedded object in here, and I'm going to go ahead and put in, let's find a grid in here, a customer grid in there. Okay, so I'm embedding a customer grid in that lower panel. So now I can go in here, and you'll notice here's my little customer grid. Well, there's nothing to say if I go, you know what? I actually want 2 customer grids, and maybe you develop 2 different ones. So I'll go here, I'm going to put an embedded object in there, and I'm going to bring in a grid, and let's go ahead and do, let's say that one. And now I have on my screen, if it works okay, you'll notice I have this grid and this grid. They could be pointing at the same data source, but showing maybe filtering it different ways. These could be list controls. I mean, it's the possibilities are endless. And what's great is that if I pop this open and run it in a web browser, then you can get that really complex desktop interface, but running in a browser. And as you can see, you can create really neat with subpanels and subcategories and things like that. So only take a moment here. And let's go. Let's see. Come on. Dun, 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 dun. There it goes. It's building it. So you can see this is all running inside of a web browser. And the cool thing is these grids are editable. So they actually, all these buttons and everything works. I've just used that panel layout to kind of structure how I want it on the screen. And you can see it's a little big, so have these things here. But that way you can build components and bring them all together into a very powerful interface. And then what's really cool is then you can use the WebSockets technology to be updating this information based on things happening on the server. But that's for another day.
Dan, thank you very much. And
thank
you everyone who attended today. Thanks for everyone who asked questions. Please send your questions into guides, G-U-I-D-E-S, at alphasoftware.com, and we'll try to get them during the week. So we are going to be out for the next 2 weeks while we prepare for and present at the Alpha DevCon conference, and we hope to see you there. Until then, take care. We hope to see you soon at another webcast. Take care and goodbye.